April 30th, 1975. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, teeters on the brink of collapse. North Vietnamese forces are advancing, unstoppable. This was the day Saigon fell, the day that marked the end of the Vietnam War, and one of the most chaotic and heart-wrenching episodes in modern history. Over the course of a single day, American diplomats, soldiers, and thousands of South Vietnamese civilians scrambled desperately for a way out, while the North Vietnamese Army closed in, ready to declare victory after years of devastating conflict. To understand the fall of Saigon, we must step back to the early 1970s. The United States had been involved in Vietnam for nearly 2 decades, supporting the South Vietnamese government in its fight against the Communist North. However, after years of brutal warfare and mounting casualties, public support in the United States had waned. By 1973, under the Paris Peace Accords, the United States agreed to withdraw its combat forces, marking what many thought might be the end of the American presence in Vietnam. But the conflict wasn't over. The North Vietnamese viewed this withdrawal as their opportunity. Despite promises of support from the US, the South Vietnamese military struggled without American forces. North Vietnam saw its chance, and by early 1975, launched a final, relentless campaign to seize the South. City by city, province by province, South Vietnam began to fall. By April, the Communists were closing in on Saigon. Inside the US Embassy, the atmosphere was tense, chaotic, and desperate. Diplomats, military officers, and hundreds of South Vietnamese civilians who had assisted the US over the years were now racing against the clock. Many knew that once the North Vietnamese entered the city, retribution against anyone associated with the United States would be brutal. Pleas for help, fear of what was coming, and the hope for survival hung thick in the air. The embassy compound, a symbol of American power in South Vietnam, had now become a cage for those trapped inside. Civilians gathered by the thousands outside the gates, hoping for a way out. In their eyes, the American flag flying over the embassy represented safety, freedom, and a last hope of escape. But for many, it would be a hope that went unfulfilled. Ambassador Graham Martin, the US ambassador to South Vietnam, had resisted the idea of evacuating Saigon for weeks. He believed that the South Vietnamese could somehow hold the line, perhaps a sentiment born of loyalty or disbelief that the United States would leave its allies to face their fate alone. But on April 29th, as North Vietnamese artillery shells began to rain down on the city, the decision was made to begin the final evacuation. The embassy was ordered to prepare for Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Operation Frequent Wind was a desperate, last-ditch effort to save as many lives as possible. The plan was simple but incredibly risky. Helicopters would ferry evacuees from the embassy to US Navy ships waiting off the coast. All throughout April 29th and into the early hours of April 30th, American helicopters flew non-stop between Saigon and the ships offshore. The sounds of rotor blades filled the air as desperate crowds gathered, hoping they would be among those chosen for evacuation. The embassy was overwhelmed. Marines stood guard trying to keep order, but it was nearly impossible. Thousands of South Vietnamese civilians who had worked with the Americans or feared retribution from the advancing communists tried to force their way into the compound. Families separated in the chaos, with children being lifted over fences and others risking everything to make it inside. Inside, the embassy compound was a hive of desperate activity. As each helicopter landed, American staff scrambled to load as many people as they could. Civilians clutching whatever belongings they could carry were hastily ushered aboard, while embassy staff shredded documents, trying to erase any evidence that could be used by the incoming communist forces. As the day turned to night, scenes of chaos intensified. The noise, the fear, the sweat, and the heartbreak all came to a peak. Every helicopter that took off carried families who would never see their homeland again. The evacuees left behind parents, siblings, and friends, but the mission pressed on. While Operation Frequent Wind unfolded in the embassy, North Vietnamese tanks were on the move, and by the early hours of April 30th, they had reached the outskirts of Saigon. The capital was already in shambles. Streets were packed with terrified civilians fleeing or searching for shelter, while soldiers from the South Vietnamese Army, either surrendered or blended into the civilian population, fearing execution. At 10:24 a.m., North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace, the symbolic heart of South Vietnam. Inside, President Duong Van Minh, who had only taken office 2 days before, ordered his forces to stand down and formally surrender to the North Vietnamese. With these words, the war that had taken millions of lives, divided nations, and left scars on an entire generation finally came to an end. The fall of Saigon marked not just the end of the Vietnam War, but the beginning of a profound transformation in Vietnam. For the North Vietnamese, this was a moment of victory and reunification. After nearly 2 decades of struggle, the country was finally united under a single communist government. For many South Vietnamese, however, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The new regime promised to establish order and unity, but with it came re-education camps, forced labor, and persecution for those who were seen as enemies of the state. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese faced imprisonment or worse, and many families were torn apart by these brutal policies. Thousands of Vietnamese, now fearing the future under communist rule, became refugees, taking to the sea in overcrowded and often unseaworthy boats in desperate attempts to flee. These boat people embarked on dangerous journeys across the South China Sea, facing starvation, piracy, and drowning in search of a safe haven. The fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, marked a significant chapter in both American and Vietnamese history. For the United States, it was a symbol of defeat and a bitter end to its long and costly involvement in Vietnam. For Vietnam, it was a hard-fought victory, but one that came at an incredible cost. Today, Vietnam is a country that has largely moved beyond the scars of war. Yet the memories of April 30th live on in the minds of those who were there and in the pages of history. Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, bears reminders of that fateful day. The embassy compound stands as a preserved monument, a place where memories of loss, survival, and sacrifice are etched into the walls and remembered by those who lived through it. The Vietnam War may be long over, but the legacy of its final day, the day Saigon fell, remains a powerful reminder of the cost of war and the resilience of those who endured it.